India is poised to be the world's third largest economy by 2030. Most Indians feel extremely optimistic and upbeat. In fact, many people believe that this is India's age. But a new book by economist Ashoka Mody paints a very different, pessimistic, and some would say grim picture. The book, India is Broken, actually talks about India's flawed and in some cases failed tryst with destiny. The author argues that India's democracy has been betrayed not once, not twice, but many times over. Is he fair in this appraisal, or is he being far too much of a negative voice, pouring cold water over all of our optimistic hopes as we begin 2023? My guest today is the Economist author Ashoka Mody, and I was up all night reading your book, and I found a strange sort of dissonance between the newspaper headlines I was consuming just in the last 24 hours, where the economic advisor to the Prime Minister was painting a very, very different picture about India's economic forecast, where Standard & Poor's rating was talking about India overtaking Japan and Germany by 2030. And you actually say that we as a country, we as a people have been betrayed many times over. Things are far from as good as most Indians would want to believe. Why do you feel so down and out about the country which you're no longer a citizen of, but in the introduction you say that you told your father you'll always be an Indian at heart. So as an Indian at heart, Ashok, why do you feel so pessimistic?
So just to thank you very much for having me. It was my father who said to me that I will always be an Indian at heart.
Correct.
And it's in that spirit that I've written this book. So when we cite figures like 1 trillion or 2 trillion or 5 trillion or 10 trillion, I depart from that convention. I look at the lived reality of people. And the lived reality, the first thing, the main thing in some ways, is jobs. And I look at what the trajectory of work has been over the last 75 years. So just to give you a simple number, if we look between 2012 and today, the Indian economy employs fewer people than it did in 2012. So yes, GDP has grown. India is a third largest or fourth largest or whatever economy. That does not mean anything to most people who live in this country.
So when Vivek Debroy, who's the economic advisor to the Prime Minister, forecasts a $20 trillion economy or nearabouts, by 2047, I think he said, you find it meaningless?
The short answer is yes.
Why?
Because the question is, there are two questions. Who does that trillions go to? And what cost does it come at? So let me explain. So when we compute GDP, we are not looking at who is the beneficiary of that GDP. There's the simple matter of inequality, but there is also the matter of the resources that we are using up. So let's take it one step at a time. The lived reality of people is, do I have work? I begin the book by in Raj Kapoor's Shri 420.
Yes.
And he comes into Bombay from Allahabad. And he says, kuch kaam batao mujhe. In 1998, Satya comes into Bombay as an immigrant also in the movie Satya. And he says, kuch kaam milega. And this is a common refrain. So if you go away from the media headlines, what is cinema reflecting? Cinema is talking about two people. And it's asking, kuch kaam milega.
There's also the aspirational cinema of Karan Johar's movies, where people are rich, they're wealthy, there are middle class, upper middle class dreams. And what's interesting is that although socialism is a principle enshrined in the preamble of our constitution, You make the very interesting argument that our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was not a socialist. You, in fact, describe his approach to development as elitist. You reference one moment where Nehru spoke about a Brahminical spirit of doing things. And you say that Nehru made an early mistake by being obsessed with steel projects, for example, as the temples of modern India. You actually say Nehru was never socialist.
No, Nehru was not a socialist. That is clear. I think Nehruji would have agreed with me. You know, he was a fair man and he was open to criticism. You may know the story that he used to look forward to Shankar's cartoons, where Shankar lampooned him mercilessly.
Yeah.
And Nehruji himself in 1963, as he was reflecting back on his tenure, said, you know, we have strayed from the path of socialism because we've allowed a oligopolistic structure to grow in this country. Imagine that if it was oligopolistic then, how much more oligopolistic it is now. But come back to the lived reality. It's jobs, it's education, it's health, it is the cities we live in, it is the air that we breathe, the water we drink, it is the judicial system that people encounter in their daily lives. If you take this bundle, that is the lived reality. And if you track that over the last 75 years, the reality is much grimmer than the very fancy total numbers that we tout. That is what I have tracked in my book.
But are all democracies not works in progress? You talk about India's democracy being an electoral autocracy, and that what happens between the elections matters also as much and doesn't get enough attention. But if you look at the United States of America, your country of citizenship today, look at what happened at Capitol Hill. Look at how Trump resisted surrendering power. I know many Indians, including myself, looking at that and saying, well, in this country, we have never had a problem with peaceful transition of power, no matter what we may think of individual leaders. Do you think you give too little credit for the fact that we're a new democracy where elections have functioned freely and fairly? For the most part, I'm not saying there have never been aberrations, especially in the age before electronic voting machines. Certainly, you used to have old headlines about booth capturing and so on. But I don't think there's anyone who believes that people don't get the government they vote for or vote out.
TK, I accept both your propositions. America is in serious trouble. So, we don't need to
benchmark ourselves
against that. What's happening on Capitol Hill last night is cringeworthy. Okay, so there's no debate on that.
Yeah.
When we talk about democracy, we have to keep asking ourselves, what is the democracy for? If you're just looking at the mechanics of democracy, that's not particularly interesting. What we are looking for is the mechanics of democracy working for the lived reality of people? I keep coming back to this phrase, lived reality, Barkha, because that's what it means. Today, the question is, between 2019 and 2022, even if we just look at the recent span, there are fewer employed people in this country than there were in 2019. And there are fewer employed people in 2019 than in 2011. And look at the quality of jobs. 24% of Indian women are in the workforce. That is the lowest in any reasonable country. It is lower than in Bangladesh. Bangladesh was below us. It's now above us. We have come down. They have gone up. Look at the issue of the quality of work. Today, construction employs more people in this country than manufacturing does.
I think you quote a figure from the railway recruitments in 2019 where you say 12.5 million Indians applied for 35,000 jobs. And then, of course, we saw those very disturbing images of young men rampaging the streets. They were upset. There was violence. But my question is this. Isn't then private enterprise the answer? Your book seems to be, and you seem to be, quite skeptical about the sort of capitalist emphasis on India's rich business people. But if public sector government jobs have only limited capacity, and hence the emphasis on private enterprise, but you don't seem very convinced about how that's gone either.
I don't think that is a fair reading of my book. I worked for 25 years at the World Bank and IMF. I believe in the market economy, 100%. There's no question. I don't think we should even go there, because the issue that the market economy should be the guiding principle is not a contested one today.
So where do you think we've gone wrong, according to you?
Education. If I was the czar of this country, I would say we must stop all policy making till we have a world-class education system. I'm an IIT graduate. My wife is an IIT graduate. My children, when they look up to me, look up because their parents are IIT graduates.
Yeah.
But the question I ask is, are the kids getting a decent education in this country? I'll give you a couple of statistics. So a 5th grader is not able to do 2nd grade math. A 8th grader is not able to do 5th grade math. 30% of Indian kids who start school drop out before they finish school. From there, they go to garbage colleges. Yes, true, this country produces very brilliant software engineers who then do all kinds of wonderful things like artificial intelligence and so on.
I mean, every single significant big tech company in the United States of America today is led by an Indian who studied at an IIT like you, or an IIN, or one of the other sort of, probably engineering colleges.
Okay, but then you can also ask the question, why are 12.5 million people employing for jobs of timekeepers and station masters and railway guards? Why is that the case? So for every Sundar Pichai that we have, how many hundreds of millions of young men do we have who are doing that kind of life? We are right to be proud of Sundar Pichai and Nadella and all these great guys. Mm-hmm. But where is our obligation as policymakers? To whom is the obligation? The obligation is to the question in 42-degree heat. Does this guy have a table fan in his house? I'm not saying don't have a market economy, but I'm saying prepare people for the market economy.
But aren't all democracies works in progress? Do you think, let me put it to you differently, do you think there's anything that we've done better at than we used to 20 years ago? Let's take the smartphone. Let's take internet access. Let's take the fact that more than 600 million Indians have access to the internet, right? That UPI, the fact that, Indians, your vegetable vendor today will be able to use tech to receive a payment from you. Are there no things that make you proud?
100%. I mean, there is this, again, to be fair to the book, all these numbers are there in the book, okay? But then, my mother was from Banaras. Every year as a child, we went in the summer to Banaras. Banaras is now known as Varanasi, which is based on 2 rivers, Varuna and Asi. Asi is no longer, Asi flows into the Ganga. Mm-hmm. Asi is no longer a river. Asi ko Banaras mein Asi Nala kehte hain. There is every river in this country, and I'm going to make a statement which may be contested. Every river is dying. You look at Hyderabad. Hyderabad, pharma capital of India. Yes, we export pharmaceuticals. A river Musi runs through Hyderabad. Usme pharmaceuticals effluents are dumped. They are developing antimicrobial resistance. The Musi River is a dead river. The point I'm trying to make is, yes, how is UPI a substitute for education? How is UPI a substitute for the guy who falls sick and cannot afford the out-of-pocket expenses? How is UPI a substitute for the fact that 75% of the prisoners in this country are under trials, who are there for sometimes longer periods than their maximum sentences if they had been tried and convicted of that crime, for which they're only allegation? How is UPI a substitute for the fact that the air we breathe and the water we drink has got all kinds of contaminants? How many lives do we lose because of that? I know that these numbers sound grim, and we want to look away from them. But what I'm trying to say is, how many people, when you talk about UPI, how many people know that Joshimath is sinking, that Hasdeo Forest is being denuded, that Aravali has been denuded, that the Western Ghats are suffering? We can live in this reality, Barkha. I'm not saying we can't. You and I are going to do well always. And I know we've got this vegetable vendor who's using UPI. But ask yourself the question, is that vegetable vendor sending his kids to school in the hope that that kid is going to graduate into something relevant?
Of course he is. Of course he wants that. Of course he wishes that for his child.
Correct. I tutor a little girl who my mother used to tutor. Now my mother is no longer here, so I tutor her long distance. She goes to a Delhi school. उसकी क्लास में 90 बच्चे हैं. कहती है जिस दिन सब बच्चे आते हैं बैठने की जगह नहीं होती है. सो आई आस्क्ड हर कि शी सेड मैं कल क्लास नहीं कर सकती हूँ क्योंकि मेरा एग्ज़ाम आ रहा है. तो मैंने कहा कहाँ तक तुम पहुँची हो? मैं तो फर्स्ट चैप्टर पर हूँ, मैडम तो 13वें चैप्टर पर है. तो मैंने कहा तुम करती क्या हो क्लास में? कहती हूँ कि मैं मॉनिटर अपनी किताब दे देती है, मैं कॉपी कर लेती हूँ, मैडम 10 मार्क दे देती हैं उसके लिए.
I'm not denying that there are many problems in the education sector, made worse by 2 years of a physical lockdown of schools. The COVID years have had a devastating impact on our children's learning capacity, actually across classes. Let's talk a little bit about Prime Minister Modi's microeconomic welfare policies. You do touch upon them briefly. When you contrast them with Nehru and the sort of the big industrial approach to economy, there's been an attempt by this government to have targeted policies, toilets for women, homes, the Jan Dhan accounts, direct cash benefit transfers, free rations. How do you evaluate the success or not of these programs?
Look, if people are getting these amenities, that's good. No one can contest that. No one is saying that the toilets is a very praiseworthy initiative. So is the cooking gas. The question that we must keep asking. So let's take the toilets, okay? Because it's a very important initiative.
Yeah.
It's part of a complex of good health. Ultimately, there is the toilet, but the toilet is one element of good health and nutrition. If you take the broad area of nutrition, Indian children still are amongst the most stunted in the world. Bangladesh is beginning to exceed India on that front. The one principle about public goods is that it is not any one thing that works. There has to be a complex. There has to be good health, there has to be good nutrition. The share of public expenditures on health and education and health and nutrition has either stagnated or declined. So we can point to a micro initiative, and you're right to do that. But we have to look at what is the envelope within which that micro initiative has occurred. Is the envelope being taken care of? We are subsidizing a semiconductor plant in Gujarat. Why are we not making our education, our primary and secondary education, world class? You know, we are at this moment as aspiring to the notion that if China falls, that we will have some ability to substitute for China. Okay, so let me give you some statistics on that. I find that talk, there's one company, the Apple's iPhone manufacturing, that is circulated 1 million times. First, American companies are moving to Mexico. It's closer to them. The garment manufacturing from China, to the extent it can, is moving to Mexico. Moving to Vietnam, to Bangladesh, to Cambodia recently. If you look at the numbers, much though we might admire the Apple iPhone coming to India, in the aggregate numbers, we are still nothing.
Fair enough, but do you ignore, in a way, geopolitics? Geopolitics today quite simply points to the fact that the Western world needs a countervailing force to China. That countervailing force, for many reasons, is India. Hence, India today is able to negotiate from a position of strength. India has taken a position on Russia that the Americans certainly don't like but can't do much about. And the Quad still exists as a sort of confluence of power. Do you, when you say India is broken, overlook the geopolitical reality today? Russia in a corner, we don't know how that war is going to end, but at the moment it doesn't look like Putin's on the strongest wicket. India still able to walk this tightrope, taking oil, condemning the war, and the West having to accept it because they need India as that counterforce to China.
Okay. No contest. I mean, I have so far not had any reason to disagree with anything that you have said, but I keep coming back, Barkha, to this question. बच्चों की शिक्षा हो रही है, स्वास्थ्य हो रहा है. Are they breathing clean air? Are they drinking clean water? Do they have a judicial system they can trust? Are they exposed to arbitrary police action? That's what I'm talking about.
Prime Minister's decisiveness led to demonetization. I say decisiveness in quotes because obviously that risk-taking gamble that he took and the debate, the impact on the economy is still being debated, even though the court in a judgment of 4-1 recently kind of validated the demonetization policy. Your views on whether the worst impact of demonetization has passed?
The demonetization came in the context of a series of shocks, followed by the GST introduction, which was done in a very chaotic way, and then COVID followed. In combination, demonetization, the botched introduction of GST, and COVID has created an enormous series of heart attacks on the informal sector. The informal sector has to go, and it has to be formalized. But this is where we come back to jobs.
Yeah.
Are there formal sector jobs? That's the question. If we are, Today, in 2022, 40+% of Indians still work in agriculture. Agriculture is distressed all over the country. Groundwater levels are falling. Urban jobs are limited. In that context, a heart attack on the informal sector, which is in effect a safety net. What is the informal sector? One thing we have to understand, most Indians cannot afford to be unemployed. So they set up a mom and pop shop. So for example, I ask my students this question. I went to buy a shampoo in Saket Market. And there's a lady sitting over there. Everyone calls her Auntie Ji. So I also call her Auntie Ji. Auntie Ji, mere ko shampoo chahiye. Auntie Ji says, sitting over there, says, "Are oh Ramu, jara aana beta, inko shampoo dikhana." Ramu comes, shows me the shampoo. He scampers away, probably to see cricket at the back where he is sitting. And Auntie Ji, then I pay her and leave. Now the question I ask you, are Auntie Ji and Ramu employed?
Are they self-employed?
They are self-employed. How much of the day is occupied in employment? And what is their earning? That is the informal sector. Yes? And then the question is, okay, so they eke out a living. But if that sector has an economic shock, what is the alternative for Ramu and Auntie Ji?
No, I saw this myself chronicling what happened to migrant workers during the lockdown. And it was a humanitarian crisis alongside the medical one. Let me ask you this, though. One of the other things we haven't spoken about, because we've been so focused on the economics, is, of course, what you call the social fractures. And you speak about, actually, every prime minister, you speak about Indira Gandhi's, what you call autocratic gamble, the emergency years. You speak about Rajiv Gandhi unleashing the forces initially of Hindutva, the demolition of the Babri Masjid, and then we come to the sort of politics of Hindutva that the BJP is, in a sense, defined by. My question to you is this. There is today, and thinkers like Pratap Bhanu Mehta have also raised this question, the need for a new language of pluralism, need for a new language of secularism. Because on the one hand, the Nehruvian sort of school of thought of secularism is contested. On the other hand, Hindutva has its obvious issues. Is there, let's ask a forward-looking question to you, because we know the problems as you define them. Is there a new language that you think can be crafted from this country of 1.4 billion people, this ancient civilization of ours?
I'm glad you came back to this. This is a very central issue. The way I frame it is that social norms and public accountability have eroded enormously over time. It started with Mrs. Gandhi, and it has gone into an irreversible state. This is a catch-22 in the sense that unaccountable politicians do not impose accountability on themselves.
And you're skeptical of charismatic politicians. I found that interesting.
In particular, charismatic politicians. Because charismatic politicians get elected without having to necessarily attend to the lived reality that I'm talking about. There is a huge temptation for charismatic politicians to have headline-grabbing policies, to build monuments. And so the question again and again has to be, I did a look at just as an example, take the Ghazipur landfill, okay? If I ask you the question, what was the year in which the Ghazipur landfill first caught fire? The answer to that is 1992. The Ghazipur landfill has caught fire every 2 or 3 years for the last 30 years. Oh, this year we are going to solve this problem. We've got some German machines, we've spent so many 1,000 crores, We've got all these plants that are going to convert the garbage into electricity. The mountain remains. Why do the rivers remain polluted? Why does Joshimath sink? Because we have lost the norms and accountability in the system. There is a certain notion of creeping normalcy. कि
ऐसा ही है.
ऐसे तो होता ही है, right? But that creeping normalcy leads to a collapse at a certain point. I'm not saying that we are at that moment. What I am saying that if these tendencies of utter disregard of the environment in which we live continues, somebody is going to pay the cost. If not you and I, our children.
Yeah. Your book says India is broken and why it's hard to fix. But I'm still going to try in my last question to ask you, as the man your father called always an Indian at heart, what is, if there was one prescriptive thought that you had for the future, what would that be?
As I said to you, I would freeze all policy making. And I would say, until we have a world-class education system at the primary and secondary level, we should not do anything else. That said, why I fear that even though I say this so loudly and so aggressively, नहीं हो रहा है education. Ashok, don't worry, सब हो रहा है, हम कर रहे हैं, बढ़ रहा है. The normative regard for education or for any kind of broad public benefit is very limited. So what I say at the end, if there has to be a hope, we have to create a new institutionalized structure for repairing norms and accountability. And the only way I see of doing that, the best example I see in this country is in the decentralization experiments in Kerala, where the people and the people who govern them are close to each other, where I can hold you accountable. That repair of accountability has to begin to occur from the ground level up. And we have to hope it percolates up from there to the entire body politic. We need a new civic consciousness.
Yeah. Well, Ashoka Mody, India is broken and why it's hard to fix. You may agree, disagree, as Raghuram Rajan says in his blurb, but the book will make you think. It has been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so
may
much.
you always remain a proud Indian at heart, despite the despair that you feel about the country of your birth.
Thank you so much, Barkha. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, bye.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.